Europe, in the centuries before the modern era, was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, their boundaries shifting with the fortunes of war and marriage. Power flowed through the hands of kings, nobles, and bishops, each bound by oaths and obligations that tethered the land together in a web of loyalties. The Church oversaw souls and monarchs alike, its influence stretching from the humblest village to the grandest throne. Daily life was shaped by local customs and allegiances, with identities rooted in village, lord, or faith rather than any sense of nation. Yet beneath this surface of tradition and fragmentation, slow but profound changes stirred. Across Europe, new currents of thought, commerce, and conflict began to unsettle the old order, questioning where authority should lie and what it meant to belong. The story of the modern nation-state begins amid this intricate tapestry of medieval life. In the centuries following the dissolution of the Carolingian Empire, Europe entered a period of profound transformation. The old imperial order, which had once stretched across much of Western Europe under Charlemagne, gave way to a patchwork of local authorities and rival powers. In this landscape of uncertainty and opportunity, the foundations of the medieval world were laid, shaping the political and social structures that would, much later, give rise to the modern nation-state. At the heart of this world was feudalism. Although the term itself is a later invention used by historians to describe the complex realities of medieval society, the system it names was a defining feature of life during these centuries. Feudalism developed as the main social system governing various lands throughout Western Europe after the fall of the Carolingian Empire. Land was the primary source of wealth and power, parceled out by kings or high nobles to their followers in exchange for loyalty and military service. These arrangements were not uniform across Europe. Instead, they were highly regional, taking different forms in France, England, the German lands, and beyond. What united them was the intricate network of obligations binding lords and vassals, and the dependence of peasants, often called serfs, on the landholders who controlled both the soil and the means of protection in a dangerous age. This system of land-based loyalty created societies that were deeply local. Authority was often fragmented, with real power lying not in distant capitals but in the hands of those who could muster knights and fortify their holdings. Medieval Europe became a tapestry of autonomous or semi-autonomous regions, each ruled by nobles whose allegiance to a monarch was sometimes more theoretical than real. The process of feudal fragmentation meant that once unified territories split into smaller and smaller parcels, each governed by its own lord with its own customs and laws. This decentralization was both a strength and a weakness, allowing communities to respond to local needs, but also making it difficult to coordinate larger efforts or maintain lasting peace. If the local lord was the center of earthly power for most people, the Roman Catholic Church was the axis around which spiritual, cultural, and often political life revolved. The Church was not merely a religious institution. In many respects, it was the most powerful entity in Europe. It owned vast tracts of land, collected taxes, and created its own laws, often wielding more authority than kings themselves. The Church shaped education, art, and the rhythms of daily life, preserving much of the Greco-Roman heritage that might otherwise have been lost. In towns and cities, its cathedrals and monasteries served as centers of learning and administration, while in the countryside, parish churches anchored communities to the wider Christian world. The influence of the Church reached into every corner of society. It united people across linguistic and political boundaries, serving as a central authority in an age otherwise marked by division. Kings and nobles alike sought the Church's blessing, and popes frequently advised or challenged monarchs on matters great and small. Power struggles between secular rulers and the papacy were a recurring feature of medieval politics, as each sought to assert supremacy. Yet, for all its authority, the Church was not immune to criticism. Over time, its perceived corruption and worldliness inspired proto-reformers, laying early groundwork for the later Protestant Reformation. Still, it remained a provider of social services, regulating individual lives through its teachings and traditions. Monarchies did exist in this period, and their role was evolving. Many kings claimed absolute power, but the reality was often far more complicated. Their authority was constantly contested, not only by powerful nobles, but also by the Church. Royal courts developed administrative institutions such as the Chancery and the Exchequer that managed royal lands, collected taxes, and enforced laws. Yet these bureaucracies were often limited in scope, and the king's reach could be quite narrow outside his own domain. The political landscape was one of constant negotiation, as monarchs tried to assert control over fractious vassals and rival claimants. Despite these challenges, the later Middle Ages witnessed the gradual transformation of monarchy from a decentralized, feudal system to more centralized forms of rule. Monarchs began to consolidate power through legal reforms, by building alliances with emerging urban middle classes, and by expanding their administrative reach. These changes were neither uniform nor uncontested. In some cases, the efforts of kings to centralize authority led to famous conflicts. The Magna Carta in England, for example, marked a significant moment when royal power was checked by the demands of nobles. Elsewhere, the rise and fall of powerful rulers, such as Charlemagne, the Norman kings, and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, reflected ongoing struggles to create political unity out of fragmentation. Efforts to create broader unity were not confined to monarchs. The papacy and, at times, the Holy Roman Empire attempted to bring order to the patchwork of European states, but these attempts at unification were, for the most part, unsuccessful. The sheer diversity of languages, customs, and laws, combined with the entrenched interests of local lords and cities, made the creation of a single, unified polity nearly impossible during most of the medieval period. Instead, Europe remained a continent of many small polities, bound together by overlapping loyalties and the pervasive influence of the Church. This era of fragmentation and localism was not static. Over the centuries, gradual political and social transformations set the stage for something new. The rise of centralized monarchies, the evolution of administrative institutions, and the slow emergence of an educated, urban middle class all contributed to the eventual formation of the modern nation-state. Yet, in the heart of the medieval world, it was the interplay of feudal obligations, monarchical ambition, and the unifying force of the Church that defined daily life and shaped the destinies of millions. While the primary sources of the period, letters, legal texts, and diplomatic documents, offer windows into the lived experience of medieval people, much remains debated by historians. What is clear, however, is that the medieval order created the conditions for later change. The world of lords and vassals, kings and bishops, was one of complexity and contradiction. It was from these foundations, both sturdy and fractured, that the modern states of Europe would eventually rise. Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries was a continent in motion, its social and political landscape shifting under the weight of profound transformation. The old order, already unsettled by crises and the gradual erosion of feudal ties, began to give way to something new and uncertain. From this turbulence emerged the modern nation-state, a political form that would come to dominate the Western world. The forces that shaped it, Renaissance, Reformation, and Revolution, were not merely the results of military conquest or royal ambition, but of deep intellectual, religious, and economic change. The Renaissance, beginning in Italy and gradually spreading across Europe, marked the dawn of a new cultural and intellectual era. Its spirit was one of rediscovery, of the classical learning of Greece and Rome, of the power of individual reason, and of the potential for human achievement. This was more than an artistic revival. It was a turning point in political thought. Renaissance humanism, with its emphasis on the dignity and capacity of the individual, began to challenge the supremacy of inherited authority. Where the church and old aristocracies had once seemed unassailable, a new class of thinkers and administrators rose to prominence, questioning the wisdom of tradition and advocating for change. Figures such as Machiavelli and Thomas More, writing against the backdrop of shifting alliances and rising monarchies, reimagined the nature of governance and power. Machiavelli's observations on statecraft, for example, reflected a world where rulers could no longer rely solely on inherited privilege or divine sanction. Instead, political success required adaptability, cunning, and a willingness to place the needs of the state above all else. In this new vision, the state became something distinct, a body defined by laws, institutions, and the collective will of its people, rather than by the patchwork of personal loyalties and feudal obligations that had characterized earlier centuries. The Renaissance also ushered in a revolution in knowledge. The questioning of Aristotelian orthodoxy, combined with the study of classical texts and the pursuit of new scientific methods, laid the groundwork for modern science and philosophy. As the boundaries of the known world expanded with the age of discovery and the spread of new technologies and trade networks, so too did the possibilities for economic and political transformation. In Italy and beyond, financial revolutions and the rise of professional administrators allowed monarchs to bypass the old nobility, forging new alliances with non-noble officials and urban elites. Centralized states, supported by legal frameworks and increasingly sophisticated bureaucracies, began to emerge from the ruins of feudal fragmentation. Yet if the Renaissance challenged old certainties, it was the Reformation that shattered them. The Church, long the dominant power in European life, found itself the target of unprecedented criticism. Reformers such as Martin Luther called not only for religious renewal, but for a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between spiritual and secular authority. The Reformation, beginning in the early 16th century, was more than a theological dispute. It was a political earthquake, as the Church's control over the levers of power was challenged by rulers eager to assert their own independence. By questioning the Church's authority and promoting the separation of secular and religious power, the Reformers undermined the very foundations of medieval society. The Reformation's impact was immediate and far-reaching. Across Europe, the creation of Protestant denominations splintered the unity of Catholic Christendom, leading to fierce wars, persecutions, and the rise of the Counter-Reformation. The Western Schism, the spread of Christian humanism and technological innovations such as the printing press, all contributed to the rapid dissemination of new theologies and the intensification of religious conflict. In the process, the old political order was transformed. The weakening of the Church's grip on political life empowered secular rulers, who seized the opportunity to consolidate their power and define the boundaries of their realms. As these forces unfolded, the very idea of the nation began to take shape. Where the medieval world had been defined by a patchwork of overlapping allegiances, the early modern period saw the emergence of more coherent political entities, states that claimed sovereignty over defined territories and populations. The concept of national identity, fostered by both Renaissance humanism and the religious upheavals of the Reformation, became increasingly central to the Western worldview. Literature, political treatises, and religious polemic all contributed to new discussions about what it meant to belong to a nation, to share a common language, faith, or destiny. The implications were profound. By 1500, Europe remained a mosaic of hundreds of small polities, each fiercely guarding its autonomy. Yet, over the next 3 centuries, a process of consolidation unfolded. The late 16th and early 17th centuries, marked by religious wars such as the 30 Years' War and economic transformations like the rise of mercantilism, saw the emergence of fewer, larger, and more powerful nation-states. Feudalism, already in decline, was swept aside by revolutions and the relentless logic of centralization. The French Revolution, at the end of this period, would provide a dramatic punctuation mark, signaling the end of the old order and the beginning of a new age of nationhood. The early modern period, then, was an age of transition, a time when old certainties gave way to new realities. The Renaissance and Reformation did not merely unsettle the status quo, they provided the intellectual and spiritual tools for imagining a different kind of society. By fostering individualism, questioning traditional authority, and promoting the idea of the nation, these movements laid the groundwork for the modern world. The rise of the nation-state was not the product of a single event or ideology, but of centuries of upheaval, debate, and innovation. It was, in many ways, Europe's answer to the challenges of its own complexity, a new framework for governance, identity, and collective purpose, born from the fires of change. The forging of the nation-state is one of the great dramas of European history, a story not of a single moment or mastermind, but of a slow, sometimes tumultuous process of consolidation, negotiation, and invention. As the 17th century dawned, the old patchwork of overlapping claims and fluid boundaries began to give way to something new, the idea that a state could be defined not only by the authority of its ruler, but by the precise contours of its territory, the reach of its laws, and the sense of a shared community among its people. This new order was shaped less by the clangor of feudal swords than by the logic of administration, the language of diplomacy, and the ambitions of monarchs determined to rule as absolute sovereigns. One of the most visible expressions of this transformation was the rise of absolutism. Monarchs such as Louis XIV of France became almost synonymous with the centralized state, gathering the reins of power ever more tightly in their own hands. Where earlier kings had often negotiated, cajoled, or even begged their way through a web of powerful nobles and semi-independent provinces, the new absolutist rulers set out to sweep away these obstacles. They were aided by the growth of professional bureaucracies, armies of clerks, secretaries, and administrators whose loyalty flowed upward, not outward. This was not merely an extension of royal will, it was the creation of an entirely new apparatus for governing, one that would become the hallmark of the modern state. In France especially, the emergence of a bureaucratic elite brought with it a more rational and predictable system of governance, replacing the haphazard patchwork of customary law and privilege with uniform procedures and standards. The roots of the modern bureaucracy, with its emphasis on merit, expertise, and systematic record-keeping, can be traced to these 18th-century developments in public administration. Yet the story of state formation in Europe cannot be told solely through the ambitions of kings and the paperwork of officials. The 17th century was also an age of catastrophic conflict, most notably the 30 Years' War, a struggle that left much of Central Europe in ruins and forced its rulers to confront the costs of disorder. Out of the ashes of this conflict came the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, an agreement that reshaped the map of Europe in ways that still echo today. The treaties that made up the Peace of Westphalia did more than end a war. They established a new system of political order, one grounded in the principle that each state, no matter its size or creed, possessed full sovereignty over its territory and the right to conduct its own affairs without outside interference. This principle, sometimes called Westphalian sovereignty, marked a decisive break from the old medieval world where popes, emperors, and local lords all claimed overlapping authority. The Peace of Westphalia is often seen as the birth certificate of the modern nation-state, though some historians debate just how foundational it truly was. What is clear, however, is that the treaties recognize not only the territorial boundaries of states, but also their right to make treaties independently, a shift that would have far-reaching implications for diplomacy and international law. With 109 delegations involved in the negotiations, the Peace of Westphalia also established the precedent of diplomatic congresses, gatherings where sovereign states met as equals to resolve their differences. This was a tangible step toward the system of coexisting states that underpins international relations to this day. The new order set forth at Westphalia formalized the nation-state as the primary unit of political organization. Fragmented authority gave way to centralized, territorially defined states entities now expected to command loyalty, enforce laws, and defend their borders. The legacy of this period can be seen in the dominance of 5 major states in European politics by the middle of the 18th century, a pattern that would persist until the upheavals of the 20th century. This consolidation was not merely a political or military achievement, but also a cultural one. As monarchs and ministers drew lines on maps and crafted new systems of administration, something subtler but no less profound was happening in the towns, villages, and courts of Europe. The rise of national languages played a crucial role in the formation of national communities. Where Latin had once served as the common tongue of scholars, clergy, and diplomats, its decline in everyday use signaled a turning inward, a growing emphasis on the languages spoken by the people themselves. This was not a simple or automatic process. It involved deliberate choices by rulers and intellectuals, and it often sparked fierce debates about identity and belonging. The interplay between language and community helped define what it meant to belong to a particular nation, and the spread of vernacular languages in administration, literature, and education reinforced the boundaries of the emerging states. The cultural history of language during this period is, in many ways, the history of nationhood itself. National languages did more than facilitate communication. They became symbols of identity, instruments of power, and markers of inclusion or exclusion. The development and promotion of a shared language helped knit together diverse regions and peoples into something approaching a national community. Scholars examining the period from 1450 to 1789 have noted that the shift from Latin to vernacular languages was central both to the expression of identity and to the consolidation of state power. It is important to note, however, that the idea of the nation-state was not without its critics, then or now. Some have argued that it was, in part, a territorial myth, a story that rulers told to legitimize their authority and encourage loyalty among their subjects. Nevertheless, the nation-state played a central role in the political integration of Europe, and its legal and diplomatic foundations can be traced in collections of primary documents, including the Treaty of Westphalia itself. The rise of the nation-state was also entwined with the realities of war and military competition. States that could command greater resources, raise larger armies, and mobilize their populations were better able to defend themselves and expand their influence. Military history and the development of state institutions were closely linked, as rulers used the twin tools of bureaucracy and violence to shape the political landscape. Underlying this transformation was a profound philosophical shift. The birth of the sovereign nation-state is often linked to Platonic Christian principles and to the decline of the medieval ideal of universal authority. The new world of sovereign states was one in which power was defined by territory, not by claims to universal rule or divine sanction. The evolution of European states and their institutions in the 18th century, documented in a wealth of primary sources, reflects this gradual but momentous change. Looking back, the emergence of the modern nation-state appears both inevitable and deeply contingent, a product of war, diplomacy, administration, and culture. Its legacy can be seen not only in the borders that shape our world, but in the very way we think about power, identity, and belonging. The nation-state may have its origins in myth as much as in reality, but by the end of the 18th century, it had become the stage upon which the next chapters of European and ultimately global history would unfold. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the world was swept along by forces both exhilarating and tumultuous, as the foundations of society were transformed by the twin engines of industrialization and nationalism. Factories multiplied, cities spread rapidly, and the patterns of daily life changed so quickly that many felt they were living in a new age. It was not just the physical landscape that shifted, but the very meaning of belonging and identity. For many, the old ties of village, guild, or province faded, replaced by a powerful sense of nationhood that promised unity and purpose. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century but truly gathered momentum in the decades that followed, was the catalyst for these profound changes. In America, the rise of industrial society after 1876 brought explosive urban growth, a new hierarchy of social classes, and an economic dynamism that seemed unprecedented. Urbanization accelerated as railways, factories, and tenements rose from the countryside, drawing millions into new urban centers. The Gilded Age, as the period from 1877 to 1900 became known, was marked by an influx of immigrants, the spread of industry, and the integration of the American West into a single national economy. The traditional rhythms of rural life gave way to the relentless pace of industrial labor, and family structures, work habits, and even leisure began to reflect the demands of modern capitalism. These transformations were not unique to America. Across Europe and beyond, the Industrial Revolution was reshaping societies on a grand scale. Cities like Manchester, Berlin, and St. Petersburg swelled as rural populations flocked to new opportunities, while the old order of aristocrats and peasants was joined and sometimes challenged by a burgeoning middle class and a mass of industrial workers. Labor itself was transformed. Instead of working the land or crafting goods by hand, millions now toiled in factories under the discipline of the clock and the manager. The social challenges were immense. Poverty, overcrowding, and alienation became common experiences, as did labor unrest and calls for reform. Yet for many, there was also the promise of upward mobility and, perhaps more importantly, a sense that they were part of something larger, a nation on the move. Migration was central to this story. Between 1880 and 1920, immigrants and their descendants formed the backbone of the American industrial workforce, linking the story of industrialization to the global currents of migration and adaptation. Factories and cities became melting pots where new identities were forged, not just along lines of class and occupation, but also of nation. This was the age when nationalism emerged as a dominant political force, shaping both individual and collective identities in ways that would prove lasting and, at times, explosive. Nationalism, as it came to be understood in the 19th century, was more than a feeling. It was a political ideology, one that insisted the interests and culture of the nation should be paramount. It called for unity, self-governance, and a shared sense of belonging, often defined by language, history, and custom. The 19th century is often called the Age of Nationalism, a period when nationalist movements flourished across Europe, Asia, and Africa, driven by the belief that state and nation should be one and the same. The story of nationalism was, in many ways, inseparable from the story of revolution and war. The revolutionary wave of 1848, sometimes called the Springtime of Nations, swept across Europe, toppling old regimes and igniting debates about citizenship, rights, and the shape of the future. In its aftermath, the unification of Germany and Italy redrew the map of Europe, while empires such as Austria-Hungary were weakened, beset by internal divisions and the growing appeal of national self-determination. The politics of the age were fluid, with parties and allegiances shifting in response to the demands of the people and the pressures of change. Debates over who belonged and on what terms became central to the evolving concept of nationhood. Imperialism, too, was a defining feature of the era. From 1750 to 1900, the so-called New Imperialism saw European powers expand overseas, acquiring new territories and establishing global empires. This was often justified, or at least explained, as a natural outgrowth of the nation-state, as governments sought to extend their power and secure resources for their people. Imperialism reshaped global diplomacy and warfare, but it also provoked fierce resistance and gave rise to new forms of national identity in colonized regions. In many cases, anti-imperial movements drew on the language and ideals of nationalism, demanding not just reform but independence and self-rule. The relationship between nationalism and the nation-state was never simple. Nationalists insisted that the boundaries of the state should match the contours of the nation itself, but in practice, most states were far from ethnically homogeneous. The rise and evolution of nationalism was a global phenomenon, often sparked by geopolitical crises and the decline of old land-based empires. In Europe, The collapse or weakening of multi-ethnic empires such as the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian realms made nationalism the main organizing principle for new societies and new states, yet the process was rarely smooth. The creation of nation-states involved difficult questions about who belonged and who did not, questions that would reverberate into the 20th century and beyond. Nationalism's influence extended far beyond Europe. In the 20th century, it would become the driving force behind independence movements across Asia and Africa, as well as a cause of conflict and war. World War I, often seen as a formative period for the modern nation-state, was both a product and a catalyst of nationalist fervor, redrawing borders and setting the stage for the creation of new states. The principle that national sovereignty should be the main source of political legitimacy, so central to the age of revolution, was now asserted with new urgency and, at times, with devastating consequences. In the United States, the development of national identity was shaped by regionalism and the evolving politics of the 19th century. The era saw the rise of nativist and nationalist movements, such as the Know Nothing Party, which reflected both the anxieties and aspirations of a society in flux. Debates over citizenship, belonging, and the nature of American identity were central to the political life of the period, as the country grappled with waves of immigration and the integration of vast new territories. Throughout this era, the nation-state emerged as the dominant model for political organization, particularly in Europe. The competing visions of national unity and diversity shaped not only the map of the continent, but the very idea of what it meant to be a people. The 19th century was thus the era of the nation-state, but also of the contradictions and conflicts that came with it. The promise of unity, the reality of diversity, and the enduring challenge of defining who, exactly, was part of the nation. As the 20th century dawned, the forces unleashed by industrialization and nationalism continued to shape the world in ways both creative and destructive. New states were born, old empires faded, and the ideal of the nation, self-governing, sovereign, and united, became the lodestar for peoples across the globe. Yet the process was never complete, never uncontested. The legacies of this era would define much of the modern world, and the questions it raised remain with us still. The modern nation-state, rooted in the Westphalian settlements of the 17th century, continues to cast a long shadow over the global landscape. Even after centuries, its essential features, bounded territory, central authority, and a claim to exclusive sovereignty remain the foundation of most of the world's political life. Yet, as the 21st century unfolds, this familiar model stands at a crossroads. The pressures of globalization, the rise of supranational organizations, and the growing influence of actors that transcend borders have begun to challenge, and in some ways transform, the very idea of national sovereignty. At the heart of our era lies a striking contradiction. On one side is the enduring power of the nation-state, still the primary actor in international affairs, still the entity to which citizens turn for protection, order, and identity. On the other, the world has become a web of interconnections so intricate and pervasive that the old narratives of absolute sovereignty can seem almost quaint. Globalism, as some observers call it, suggests that the world is increasingly bound together by flows of capital, information, and people flows that defy the neat boundaries drawn on political maps. The autonomy of nation-states is not what it once was. Economic decisions in one country can send ripples or shockwaves across continents. Social movements and online communities now span the globe, organizing and exchanging ideas in real time, beyond the reach of any single government. Multinational corporations, too, wield resources and influence that rival or even surpass those of many states, their operations indifferent to the lines that separate one jurisdiction from another. Historically, military activity and competition played a central role in the formation and evolution of nation-states. The ability to mobilize armies, defend borders, and project power was often the measure of a state's status. But today, new dynamics are emerging. The threats and opportunities of the present are frequently transnational. Climate change, cybersecurity, pandemics, and financial instability do not respect borders. In this environment, the old tools of power, armies, fortifications, closed borders can seem ill-suited to the challenges at hand. For developing countries, the influence of globalization is especially acute. The shifting tides of global markets, the requirements of international institutions, and the volatility of capital flows can reveal both strengths and vulnerabilities. Power is sometimes wrested from national governments, not through conquest or revolution, but through the quiet mechanisms of economic integration and regulatory harmonization. As global economic forces and international organizations grow in stature, the sovereignty of individual states is tested and, in some cases, diluted. The relationship between globalization and national sovereignty has become one of the defining issues of the contemporary international order. Structures of governance that once seemed settled are now sites of tension and negotiation. As globalization intensifies, states must navigate the delicate balance between maintaining autonomy and participating in collective decision-making at the global level. This is not merely a theoretical concern. The frameworks established to manage trade, environmental standards, human rights, and security often require states to accept limits on their absolute authority in exchange for the benefits of cooperation. Perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the rise of supranational organizations. The European Union stands as a prominent example. Its member states have chosen to cede aspects of their sovereignty to central institutions, pooling authority in pursuit of shared goals, whether economic prosperity, peace, or freedom of movement. These arrangements are voluntary, but their consequences are profound. Decisions made in Brussels or Luxembourg can shape laws, regulations, and even the daily lives of citizens in capitals from Lisbon to Helsinki. The United Nations and the World Trade Organization offer other models of supranational governance, each enabling states to collaborate on matters of shared concern, while sometimes requiring them to surrender a measure of autonomy. In joining these institutions, states are not coerced but choose to participate in systems that facilitate cross-border exchanges and manage conflict for mutual benefit. This process illustrates how the doctrine of absolute sovereignty is being revised, sometimes quietly, sometimes amid great debate. Supranational institutions are entities whose decisions and authority can, at times, supersede those of individual states. Members agree, often through painstaking negotiation, to abide by collective decisions, recognizing that some goals are simply unattainable by acting alone. The rights of nations in this interdependent world are the subject of ongoing debate, with sovereignty sometimes standing in the way of international cooperation, and at other times serving as a bulwark against unwanted interference. Yet, the story is not one of simple erosion or replacement. The nation-state is not vanishing, nor is its sovereignty being wholly dissolved. Instead, what emerges is a dynamic landscape in which states continuously renegotiate the terms of their participation in the global order. Economic sovereignty, for example, is less a fixed possession than a balancing act between national priorities and the demands of a tightly connected global marketplace. Governments must weigh the benefits of integration, access to markets, investment, and innovation against the risks of dependency, loss of control, and exposure to external shocks. At the same time, the pressures on states are mounting. Economic, demographic, and environmental challenges grow more complex each year, and the public's expectations of what the state should provide have only increased. In many places, state capacity is stretched thin, and the ability to deliver on promises can be undermined by forces beyond any government's control. Regional integration and the rise of subnational actors, cities, provinces, and even corporations, further complicate the picture, as these entities sometimes act with a degree of independence once reserved for states alone. There are countervailing forces at play as well. While some lament the dilution of national sovereignty, others point to the progress made possible by international cooperation, progress in areas such as health, development, and the maintenance of peace. The United Nations and other international organizations serve as platforms for this kind of integration, supplementing the traditional state system with new forms of partial and regional order. As the world becomes ever more interdependent, many scholars believe that the doctrine of absolute, unqualified sovereignty is increasingly seen as outdated. The contemporary international system is stitched together through arrangements that are complex and overlapping regional unions, trade blocs, and partial orders that supplement rather than supplant the nation-state. The rights and responsibilities of states are continually debated and redefined, reflecting both the legacy of Westphalia and the realities of a world that is, in many ways, fundamentally new. Looking ahead, the future of the nation-state seems likely to be one of adaptation rather than disappearance. Its legacy endures, but its contours are changing, shaped by the inexorable pull of global forces, the demands of collective action, and the persistent need for communities to define themselves in an age of connection and uncertainty. The great experiment of sovereignty, so central to the last several centuries, continues, now played out on a stage that is both broader and more intricate than ever before.